evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation, our last of 2021, a year when we have hosted at least 50 Milim events. I think personally I've lost count. Now, wherever you are in the UK and wherever you are in the world, welcome. We once again have an international audience and we are blessed to have an international speaker too. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Timothy Shafert, and I'll introduce Timothy in just a moment. You're welcome to ask questions. Please do this at any time you like by typing in the question you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. Please also note the chat facility. This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be available on our website at milim.org.uk in the near future. There you will find recordings of past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest. Timothy Shafert is the author of 6 novels, most recently The Perfume Thief, which we will be discussing today. He's Professor of English and Director of Creative Writing at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he's also the author of the column The Eccentricities of Gentlemen for the popular lifestyle magazine Essential Living. He joins us from Omaha today. Timothy, a very warm Milim welcome to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, I imagine most of our audience haven't read The Perfume Thief. So for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with the book, what's it all about?
Well, sure. So the narrator is the title character, a woman named Clementine. She's 72 years old, and she's made a life stealing perfume in a variety of ways, in a variety of manners. So it's so she's gained a notoriety over decades and throughout the world. And we meet her in 1941 in Paris, the winter just after the Nazis have invaded and taken over the city. And so it's about her negotiation of life and kind of her own internal conflicts in terms of her relationship to theft and thievery, and the theft and thievery going on around her, and the treachery, and ultimately the espionage that she's drawn into is also informed somewhat by her past and some reflection on a relationship that she had in 1890s Manhattan.
Now, the character of Clementine is written in the first person. Did you find this hard to do? And I wonder whether the gender ambiguity this character had was actually a help or a hindrance in getting inside the head of the character.
I don't think that inhabiting the character was really the most challenging part. I mean, I think for me, I'm always I feel like an actor sometimes inhabiting a character for the stage or whatnot. And so I think once I found her voice, it was just simply a matter of having her reflect on the things that were going on around her. And so I don't think that there was any particular, there weren't really instances where I was at all necessarily troubled by her perspectives. I think that the challenge came in trying to figure out exactly how anyone would react to the circumstances, and thinking in terms of like, well, how does she go on with her life, and how does she reflect on her past meaningfully, and how does she perceive these events that are going on around her as her neighbors are arrested, and as the city is under occupation. But of course, that ultimately is what the book is about, you know, and we can raise the same questions today. What business do we have talking about books, right? When the world is on fire around us. I mean, certainly World War II was a much more extreme example of that, I suppose, but that it ends up being about her contemplation of the meaning of beauty, I guess.
So you were talking about Paris in 1941. You also write, I think, about Manhattan in a slightly earlier time. Was there something particular about these times and these places that made you want to write about them?
Yeah, I had the concept of a perfume thief in mind before anything else. And so I was writing another book, actually, and it was about 1920s Hollywood. And so there was this Gatsby-like party that I was describing, and these notorious figures who were arriving. And so it was just a cast-off listing of people like, oh, and there across the room is the famous perfume thief. And so I got distracted and preoccupied by that concept, and eventually put the 20s Hollywood novel aside and started thinking about, well, what would that entail? How would someone, would anyone, would that make sense? And what would dignify, what qualities what pursuits would a perfume thief have, and would it be lucrative, and would it make sense in any way in any way whatsoever? And so as I explored that, which involved some historical research, but also just some imagination, I guess, I eventually built this career. And I had this notion that I would just write about her various crimes throughout her life. And so I had this notion that I wanted for her to be born 100 years before I was to the day. So I was going to have her being born in 1868. And then the book was going to end on her 100th birthday on the day of my birth in 1968. And so I was contemplating, so I was keeping a list of things and moments when I would want the novel to pause and reflect on her crimes. Well, publishers tend to like, and readers tend to like books with plots. And so a series of vignettes or episodes was probably not going to serve those interests. So eventually I did, on that timeline, I was thinking, oh, well, it would be interesting. She'll be 72 in 1941 and in 1940 and 1941. And so that would be an interesting time to have her in Paris, to think about the role of perfume at that particular time. And the more I looked into that, the more I considered what was going on in Paris, the more I got drawn into the history of it, and decided that was going to take a fair amount of research and consideration. And so that ended up being where a lot of my psychic energy went into the book. And so, and also in conversation with my agent, who's like, yeah, write the 1941 part. And so then the reflection that she has into the 1890s, and at one point she's also reflecting somewhat on prohibition in the United States. That those were moments that I had done a little research as well too. So she's ended up being set in 1941 with some, I guess, flashbacks or some extended reflections on the past.
To get inside Paris at that point in time, you have a character in the book, Voss, who's written books about Paris, a Nazi officer or senior Nazi person, but he in the past has written books about Paris. Did you use books from that period to explore what the city might be like at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to get a sense of what the Parisians might have felt that they were losing, and really to try to get to the heart of that sense of loss. And so it seemed to me that within those guidebooks celebrating Paris from the 1920s and 1930s, and especially ones that are long out of print. I mean, books that were really written for the moment was what I was looking for, so that I could draw particular details that you wouldn't necessarily find in other contemporary books about Paris. And so I looked at quite a few books that some I found at the library, some that I found through secondhand booksellers with their bindings falling apart, and these very, very idiosyncratic perspectives on the delights of Paris. And so those were a great gift. I mean, those just like fell from heaven, and yeah, some of them had pink covers with gold and gold engraving and some wonderful illustrations. And so reading those and exploring the Paris through that idiosyncratic point of view. And of course, I have no way of knowing whether any of that was an honest representation of the city at all. These could have been highly idiosyncratic points of view of people who maybe were never even in Paris. But and I don't read French well enough to be able to use those particular portraits of Paris. But I even liked that better, and that I was using these frail, outdated guides to the particular delights of Paris in the 20s and 30s. And so that then I felt like then I had a sense of how Clementine and her friends might really feel the sense of deprivation. Aside from all the treachery and tyranny of the war, there was also just the loss of the city itself and its delights.
You certainly bring it to life in a very convincing manner. I don't suppose anybody reading it would particularly be able to argue whether it was authentic or not, but you bring it convincingly to life. The book is written in quite short chapters, and this allows you to weave narratives from different time periods together as the book progresses. And I wonder how much of this was planned out, or how much of it just happened as you were writing the story. Did you start with a plan, or did it evolve as you were going?
It just evolved from my brilliance. I just sat in front of my computer and it just spilled out of me. No, I mean, the book has existed in many different forms since I first wrote it. I mean, so there was the period when I was doing all the research and doing all the writing, and I got it to the point after much revision and much writing to the point where I'm like, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly the book that I want. Well, then you try to bring it out into the world, and your agent has opinions, and then the various editors that she sends it to have opinions, and then the editor that you finally end up with, they have a lot of opinions. and there was a particular long period where before the book was scheduled for release. And so, which is usually I sell the book and it comes out maybe a year later, but this was, I think, 2.5 years from the sell point and publication. And within that 2.5 years, there were the different stages of, and that wasn't because it needed so much work, I don't think, but because of the way that they situate the books on their calendars. And so, so I had a lot of opportunities to write towards my editor's suggestions, and then to write further to them. And as things would change, then other things would change. So it's a highly constructed novel. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's radically different than the version that I sent in. I mean, the bulk of the material is all the same, but there was a lot of resituating. I really wanted to play off the whole Scheherazade component of, so at one point Clementine, in order to get what it is that she wants, she finds herself ingratiating herself with this Nazi officer who's sympathetic to her to a certain degree, and sympathetic to her various interests and mission, and even sympathetic to her as a notorious thief. And so in order for her to gain access, she also has to befriend him and spend time with him. And so she has various strategies for doing that. And one of them, she realizes, is simply storytelling. And he's interested in her past, he's interested in her crimes, and he's interested in her love affairs. And so she taps into that, which ultimately then leads her to tap into her own psychology and her own net sense of memories and memory banks and things and emotions that she thought she'd moved on from, that are revived in this storytelling. And so in the book, originally, she sits down, tells the story, and then we get the story. But the thing about that is that, as you may know from other books that you've read, sometimes that's a story within a story can be kind of deflating in a sense. I mean, it can slow the book down, or you feel like you become more removed from the present action of the story in a way that maybe makes us impatient as readers. And so that came up in discussion with both my agent and my editor as we were revising the book, that maybe that it seemed like every time I said, oh, and then she told this story, it seemed to send the novel into, sort of put us to sleep, I guess. So, so then it was a matter of, figuring out where exactly those moments from the past needed to be situated and how they needed to be situated in the narrative. So that ended up being, so even though the material stayed the same for the most part, there was a lot of work in figuring out the timing of that in terms of figuring out how it should be revealed and how that can engage the reader and pull the reader along rather than slow down the narrative.
It certainly works. It creates a sense of tension, and there's almost an element of it being a thriller at some points, where you are really, the reader is really anxious to know what happens next, but yet you're not going to find out straight away. You're kept hanging, which I imagine is the skill of rebuilding the book in order to create those tensions and those senses of anticipation.
And I'm a huge fan of old movies and Hitchcock movies especially. And in Hitchcock movies, when you watch them, you're engaged and you're interested in it, but it may not necessarily be because of the plot, but you do follow the plot and you're curious about it. But half the time I don't really know even what's going on. It's like if I were to describe for you the plot of Notorious, for example, I'm not sure I'd be able to even sputter it all out accurately. But and you never really know what it is that they're after exactly or why they're after it, and it kind of shifts throughout. And so I did definitely have that in mind when I was writing the book myself, and that became also sometimes that rose up in the editorial process too, of like, well, what is it exactly that the Nazis want, and what is it exactly that Clementine wants, and what is the Perfume Diary, and what role does it play? Because ultimately a lot of the plot hinges on this collection of perfume recipes that may or may not exist. And I was sometimes of the thinking of like, well, do we really have to know? I mean, is it enough to know that they want it and it's an object but so there was that involved, that was some fine tuning and finessing.
But I suppose they want it, but actually it's useless, isn't it, without knowing so much more. And I think that's also the brilliant thing, that it's this sense that this is going to change the world for them, but actually how could it?
Right. And so they become so invested in
what they haven't got.
And gaining access to something that and what the book might contain also changes for the characters as the book moves on. It's like, oh, well, they want it for this purpose. Well, no, actually, they want it for this purpose. They want it for that purpose. And I will say that in the very first draft that my agent submitted, the thing that they were all after was something else entirely. So it was, there was some kind, I guess I was somewhat under the influence of Raiders of the Lost Ark, because there was a religious component, a religious relic that played into the part. And that was something else that I discovered in the research too, is that whole religious relic component of Hitler's interest really is pretty much myth and confined in a large part to the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So then it became a matter of trying to figure, well, then how does this religious relic make sense? And eventually that was the first thing that my editor said, it doesn't make sense. That needs to go entirely.
Now, the author of the Perfume book is Pascal, and I don't think we actually meet Pascal in the book, do we? He figures large. He looms over the whole novel, but we never really get to meet him. We learn about him. Who did you base him on? Was he, because he's the perfumier, and he's a Jewish perfumier, and I imagine there were Jewish perfumers in France, possibly who tried to escape the Nazis. Was there something to back this character up?
Not initially. I mean, the one component of the Perfume Diary that ends up playing a part in the plot really required the perfumer to be Jewish, and so it wasn't until later that I looked up those perfumers who were Jewish, and as you indicate, those who were leaving the country or leaving Paris under the circumstances. And probably the most famous example was the house of Caron. And I'm gonna look up his name so that I don't get it incorrect. Ernest Daltroff. So he started the House of Caron, and early in the 20th century, and a great innovator, and someone who had remarkable insights into not just the creation of perfume, but the selling of it, the marketing of it, and understanding what women in particular were looking for, and really able to identify and to intuit the way women wanted to represent themselves, or the way they wanted to think of themselves. And so one of his famous perfumes was Tabac Blanc, which came out as women started smoking cigarettes and smoking in public. And so the perfume spoke to that identity and that liberation, at the same time serving the practical purpose of disguising the smell of cigarettes, or attempting to anyway, and mingling with that cigarette smell and the smell of smoke in innovative ways. And so Ernst Daltroff was this genius. He was there was a woman that he partnered with who did some of the business of design work for him, and ultimately she took over the business. Ernst left around 1939, anticipating what was to come. And as I understand it, she negotiated in a similar way with the way Clementine in my novel negotiates with the Nazi officer, in which the Nazi officer offers a certain level of security, and so ultimately Ernst Daltroff was able to maintain the business from the United States and continue to do business, although he died shortly after coming to America. So and of course the great the Wertheimer brothers behind Chanel, they were quite savvy in their business dealings as well, in terms of determining when the time, anticipating what was to come, and determining how to do business in the United States in a way that did not make Coco Chanel happy, but ultimately allowed them to continue to do the business that they were doing.
And this was because she was getting 10%, and then she was getting 10% of 10%. And yes. I think you've written she was still one of the richest women in the world, but it wasn't enough.
That's right. That's right. So so she was a bit soured by the whole experience.
Now, one of the things that stands out in the book, there are many things that stand out in the book, but one of them is the many brands of perfume that you created, the many fictitious brands of perfume that appear throughout the book. Did you sort of have a session of creating brands, or did they pop up as you went along? Because this can't be an easy thing to invent a myriad of names for perfumes.
Well, some of the names are real, and some of them are made up, and so. So in some instances, when she's identifying some of the classic scents, those were drawn from history. At one point, she also lists perfumes that she wanted to suggest by nature of their title, because they would suggested scandal, or sort of a kind of, she felt they were provocative names, and those were drawn also from history. But the perfumes that she herself creates in her perfume shop, because she's, at this point in her life, she is retired from perfume thievery, and she's opened up a little shop in Paris thinking that she is retired, and she bottles these perfumes for her clientele who wander in, and ultimately goes to design perfumes for the women who work at a neighborhood bordello. And so she, but those confluence of scents were ones that I drew from. I mean, I just kept in notebooks. I was doing the World War II research, and I was also doing research into scent and into perfume, and so I was reading, 19th century recipe books, but also books that were articles written for the pharmaceutical industry, and guides to pharmacists in concocting perfumes. So I was collecting scent everywhere I could, and so and collecting it from and trying to identify the more unusual scents, or the rare scents, or something that might be considered rare that people might just want to smell. The smell of the woods from some deforested part of the world or something, like these suggested themselves in the research, and I would take notes. And then in trying to figure out, because at one point, Clementine describes the perfumes that she's creating for her friend Day based on Day's lovers, her extensive list of lovers over the years. And so that was a matter of pairing the characteristics of a lover with what might sound or might seem like it would suggest a provocative perfume. And so that's where I felt like I was indulging my imagination. I mean, you're writing about history, you're somewhat constricted, or writing about a real place like Paris that has been written about so much. You're really writing to the qualities of those places in that time. But within that realm, there was the perfume where I could really mix things up a little bit, and it was fun to think about the character of a perfume and perfume writing in general too. I mean, if you read perfume blogs or you read magazines describing perfume, it's kind of like wine. It's like part of the appeal of the product ends up being how it's defined for you and what it suggests, and a lot of that is from imagination. I mean, and if I'm tasting a glass of wine, I might be trying to draw from my brain the various flavors and scents that are suggested by it. And it's the same thing with perfume. I mean, there's certain qualities that may not be literally within the scent, but that you can draw from it. And so that was what I was indulging.
And this idea that her perfumes don't use ambergris and civet and these horrible animal extracts, which apparently make perfume smell fantastic. Is that something that would have been real at the time, or is that more of a comment through modern day eyes?
There were perfumers that resisted animalic components of their perfumes. I mean, it was not in fashion, certainly. I mean, because those civet and musk and ambergris would give the perfume a kind of anchor that was that served the fragrance and served the industry in various ways. And so so she wasn't exactly speaking on trend with her inclinations in that direction, but and I think that if I remember correctly, those animalic components also give the perfume a little more integrity. I mean, it lasts longer, and it conveys its scent more powerfully, and that would have been an element that would have been unique to the early 20th century, as they were getting away from when it became more serious as an industry, and you could charge more, and as opposed to the perfumes of the 19th century, which were more ethereal and really didn't last terribly long. So, and then the age of the synthetic, which also came about in the earlier half of the 20th century, also affected the industry in various ways. So she was kind of anticipating that to a certain degree, but and that was another component that was that played a larger part in the earlier drafts of the book, was that more naturalistic approach to perfume was something that informed her approach to the world more than ultimately it does in the book. I mean, in the final book.
We have a question from Pessy Kraus, who is watching in Jerusalem. Is there a difference between perfume and scent?
Yes, there is. So, I mean, I think I was researching both. And so there was, I wanted to be aware of the perfume industry, and I wanted to be aware of its characteristics and how it operated and how it was successful. Because the thing about a perfume that makes it successful isn't necessarily just the perfume itself. It's not just what's in the bottle. And like I was talking about in terms of perfume bloggers today and advertising and articles and such, we're projecting onto it. I mean, it's something that we can read into and we apply our own imagination to interpret the perfume, and so a perfume might be successful just by itself and by its own scent, but its success is going to be informed by the bottle. It's going to be informed by the box it comes in. It's going to be the advertising campaign, the designer who releases it, and its notoriety, its expense, and so. So the perfume industry is very much informed by these interpretations, just as much as by the scent ultimately. And so you have the process of figuring out the scent and how it works, and then the perfume becomes something that has so many other components as well.
Now, there are quite a few things in the book that are real. The painting of Gabrielle d'Estrées and one of her sisters, for example, which is indeed in the Louvre, as you point out. What's your particular interest in this painting? Well, perhaps you should tell our audience a little bit about the painting.
Sure. So I'm sure you've seen it, or maybe you haven't, but it's basically two women from the waist up, very pale. They both look basically like the same woman. And what's distinctive about it is one is pinching the nipple of the other. And if I'm picturing it correctly, they're both looking straight ahead at the viewer. And so, but there's just this gesture of pinching the nipple. And there's other stuff going on as well. There's a woman who appears to be sewing in the background. And I think there's maybe a painting hanging on the wall. And basically, we don't know really anything at all about it. I mean, I don't know even if we're certain that it is Gabrielle d'Estrées and her sister. I think that's a kind of assumption that's been made as well. But it's grounded in historical evidence, at least. So, but in terms of the individuals depicted, but the entire purpose and what's being communicated is a real puzzle. And so I became aware of it because from when I was a kid, I think it's in the opening of Monty Python's Flying Circus. I think that there's a moment where it's animated a bit, I believe, and so it's just a picture that suggests so much. I mean, they're sisters, but it also and historians believe that the gesture towards the nipple is indicative of Gabrielle d'Estrées' pregnancy, and but it's open to interpretation to a certain degree, I think. And so the characters in my novel interpret it, and that those interpretations then inform the cultural appreciation of the painting and how it's incorporated into a particular bottle of perfume.
Mm. And it has a possibly an LGBT message as well. And you have this idea of a perfume called Gabrielle, which is almost a sort of nod and wink message that the lesbian women of the time were able to give to each other or ask each other, you know, are you wearing Gabrielle? Is that grounded in anything real, or is it just your imagination?
That just came from my imagination, as far as I know. I mean, I've not heard any particular references to that level of communication. Certainly, you know, historically throughout the 20th century, queer people had to communicate in different modes and means, and had to read between the lines in terms of determining what was being communicated and how it was being communicated. The fact that they were communicating at all is and that some of those communications we can interpret today is fascinating. But it seems like there are all kinds of secret codes and secret messages that we'll never know and we'll never be able to interpret. So that to me played into this notion of the power of perfume and scent, and what might be possible in terms of how a lesbian woman might approach another lesbian woman. And so that just all kind of spun about from not so much from the research, but from just common sense, I guess. And once you get that little spark of a notion, then you think, and then whole worlds and whole systems can develop. But no, yeah, that's it's not literally based on any kind of messages.
There are a few other things that caught my attention, and I wondered whether they were real. And I think if I've learned anything from this book, the most bizarre things often are real. You talk about floral asphyxiation. Is there such a thing as floral asphyxiation?
Yeah, it's a term I did not invent. It's a concept that the idea of being suffocated by flowers, and this romantic notion of expiring from sheer beauty like that. And another thing that I did not make up, but is actually in the historical record, is the subcutaneous perfume, and the notion that there was, and I think this was, as far as I can tell, a purely American notion of what was going on in Paris in terms of the demi-monde at the turn of the century, and the Belle Epoque, and the notion that the women of Paris were injecting with syringes perfume into their veins, with the notion that they could just sort of expel this scent. And there are little bits of evidence that perhaps that sort of thing was going on, but yeah, so there's these. I was looking for any kind of connection between perfume and death, I guess, or the biological hazards of complete indulgence in perfume.
And what about the scent of butterflies, or the scent that butterflies collect?
That was based on actual research being
Really?
done in the early 20th century, late 19th century. There was these interpretations. I mean, this notion that butterflies gave off a scent in the mating process, and but then which is completely, I think, is still supported today in butterfly research. But I don't know that the scents themselves were identified in the way that they were by some of those researchers who did really liken it to perfume that people could actually just smell them. So humans could smell and identify. And so I was drawing from some books and articles that were written, and that I want to exploit further. I have a whole other butterfly book in mind.
And there's another book mentioned, this Odographia. I think that was actually real, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was real. And so, yeah, it's a prop in the book, and it was informed some of my research, and it was it was a great find from like the 1870s, if I remember, maybe 1890s. I have that written down someplace too, but that was let's see, where is that? Yeah, maybe not. But yeah, it was a book that was specific to, I think, the pharmaceutical industry in terms of not just scent but also flavor, and it was so strange, and it's spectrum of scent and flavor, and so specific, and that I wanted to like take things from it, but I didn't want to steal it. I wanted to give it proper credit. I mean, other stuff you can kind of take bits and pieces from here and there. And I figured, I'll put that in the research note at the end. But this was an instance where I felt like these details were so specific and so provocative that I needed my character to identify exactly where she was getting them from.
Now, Yvonne Cheney, who is watching in California, is interested in the roundup of Jews by the French authorities and how that might have informed your writing. And I suppose let's back that with another question of mine, which is this Green Spoons furniture shop, which is turned into what looks like a store of looted goods for certain people to go and shop in. What did you uncover when you were sort of looking at the Nazi, the Nazi occupation of Paris at that time?
Sure. I mean, so before the Nazis arrived, many people were leaving Paris in anticipation of their arrival, and there was uncertainty about exactly what the impact of the Nazis would be on the Jewish population of Paris and France, but certainly everyone knew what was going on in Germany. Everyone knew what was going on in Austria, and so there was fear, but people didn't know exactly to what extent things would carry out into, and so I that was part of the reason why I did write the book in first person, and not just first person, but present tense. I mean, even though that's an artificial design, really, it nonetheless, I mean, for it to communicate, I mean, for it to indicate that the narrator doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, she's our narrator. So a lot of times a third person narrator will indicate that they're looking back from a vantage point of where they can offer additional perspective and insight into the things that happen. A lot of time that's what storytelling is, right? I mean, we're talking about things that have happened, and we're bringing to that storytelling our moral assessment. And I wanted for this to be a case where she didn't know exactly what the war would bring, and the danger and the extent of the tyranny of the Nazis. And so there was, so the book does reference the Aryanization laws and what was happening to Jewish businesses and the theft of Jewish homes. Those Jews, most of the Jews being sent to camps were those who had immigrated from Germany into Paris, and so there was a great deal of confusion and uncertainty, as well as a fair amount of certainty. I mean, of like, there was the uncertainty, but there was also the certainty of like, well, we know exactly what's happening. We know what's going on. We can see the businesses being taken over, and we know what's at risk, and we know what's being stolen. And so that department store. So yeah, there's the moment where the narrator is basically among other French people shopping, the spoils of war, basically, specific to Jewish homes. And so, and that the Nazi that's the main character in the book too is also a major part of that. And so, and that was actually, there were actually department stores like that. So it's, and I meant for that, I mean, you have Clementine, the perfume thief, who's led a life of taking things, who's led a life as a criminal, and and her crimes have been of the ethereal nature. I mean, she's been taking vapor in essence, and then that, I mean, for that to kind of contrast with the treachery of the Nazis and of those criminals, and what was going on in the world and in Europe at the time.
We have an interesting question here from Sulia Rose. Tim, how do you experience perfume? What are your favorites?
Gosh, so how do I experience it? I feel like my sense of scent is not as refined as Clementine's and others in the book and other people who write about perfumes. So a lot of my exploration of perfume and design and perfume in the book was really semantic to a certain degree, or based on description, or meant to communicate character, I guess, and so it's more conceptual, I guess, than it is. I mean, some of the perfumes that I described that Clementine puts together, I don't know what they would smell like exactly, or how well they would smell, but I'm trying to capture some quality of it and anticipate how it might smell. But so yeah, I'm terrible at identifying scents in perfume, so I can certainly smell it and decide whether it pleases me or not. And I can sometimes kind of compare it to something, but if put on the spot, I don't think I would be able to convey the essence of a perfume if you just held it up to me. And I don't think I'm very good at recognizing perfumes even that I know when I smell it on people. So I guess I'm fairly inept as a perfume
and do you have a favorite
connoisseur.
Do you have
a favorite?
Yeah.
Well, lately I've been getting into these. I buy a lot of sample kits, I have to say, rather than spending the big money on the big bottle. And so there's a French perfumer named État Libre d'Orange, and you can get a nice sample kit from them for like $40, I think, and it comes in any number of really like its whole collection practically, and those they have provocative names like I Am Trash and Tom of Finland, and so those scents I think are I enjoy those. I enjoy those. I like scents that have a certain spice, like sweet and spice quality, I guess, to
them. So just to say to our audience, if you have more questions for Tim, please put them in the Q&A now, because we don't have too long left. Let's talk about Day. You mentioned Day. She's a singer. She's an American singer. Was she based on anybody particular?
Yeah, I was drawing from the history of Josephine Baker, who's somebody that I feel like I've always known. Like I'm not sure when I first learned about her. I mean, she would have been alive still when I was a little kid, and so I remember maybe there was news of her death that resonated with me. But I just adore her, and even at the point when my editor asked me to write research notes for the end of the book, I didn't mention her at all, and my editor's like, "Well, where's Josephine Baker?" And I'm like, "Well, I didn't do any research into Josephine Baker. I've just always known. I've just always read about her and always been aware of her." And so, so not only is Day inspired by Josephine Baker, she's a much less famous version of Josephine, but the entire book, the entire sensibility, I think, is informed to some degree by her, and it was exciting to see her brought into the Pantheon recently in the last couple of months, and honored in that way, but she. And she was somebody that loved perfume and I don't know that she necessarily had a signature scent, even though a number of perfumers did claim that theirs was her signature scent. And there were any number of perfumers that invented scents for her. There she was sometimes actually pictured on the bottle. I don't know whether that was always licensed or not, but she was so closely associated with perfume. And in her castle that she lived in France in the 1960s, she had designed a couple of bathrooms that were designed after the color schemes of her favorite perfumes, one being Lanvin's Arpège, and when she worked, incorporated black and gold. And so it was almost like she wanted to live inside, like when she was in the bathroom, like she was inside one of those perfume bottles.
So definitely a strong connection with perfume, with that character. Clementine is a crook, and I noticed that in one of your previous books, The Swan Gondola, you wrote about a con man. Is there something fascinating about criminal minds that draws you to write about them, or is it just coincidence that you've sort of covered two people on the wrong side of the law?
I guess it's a preoccupation. I mean, and certainly one of the parts of that really captivated me in writing The Perfume Thief was considering, again, like the semantics of it, the language of it, how Clementine would rationalize her crime, and how she could consider herself a moral and responsible person, regardless of having a life of crime. And so there are these moments where, whether she believes it or not, she's able to articulate why she can still consider herself an upstanding citizen of the world, you know, and yet at the same time recognize the indulgence and the appeal and the threat and danger and delight in taking from the rich, you know. And so she's somebody who starts off in life with nothing. She grows up in a farm in the middle of Nebraska, and then runs away from the farm with nothing in her hands, and so she has to build a life from there. And I think that's an element in the Swan Gondola as well, in which it's partly about thievery, but it's also about being poor and surrounded by the rich, and wanting to deprive the wealthy of some component of their goods and a component of their pride, or whatever it is, whatever damage you can do in taking something from someone else, I think is of appeal to these characters. And with the additional conflict and complication in The Perfume Thief of having to equate your crimes with the more extreme crimes, the more powerful crimes going on around you.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you will have never been asked this question before. Another one from Pessy Kraus, who is fascinated by the books behind you and wonders whether there might be a book which influenced the process of choosing the theme for The Perfume Thief, or is there any book which you feel is most important to you?
Oh, wow. Gosh, I mean, is there a book that informed The Perfume Thief? I really think, yeah, I mean, I would say that the Virginia Woolf is a great influence on me, and her book Orlando is one that I've read many times and I've taught many times, and I never tire of its wonders. You know, I feel like it's every time I read it, it's a new process of discovery. It's a new reading of it every time I pick it up. And initially, when I was writing The Perfume Thief, I was thinking of Clementine as a more realistic, or as realistic as I get, I guess, approximation of Orlando. So whereas the character of Orlando we visit throughout a period of 300 years, and sometimes Orlando is a man and sometimes a woman, I liked the idea of a realistic approximation of someone who maybe lived their life within 100 years within a possible lifespan from 1868 to 1968 as a queer woman. And so it's so definitely, yeah. And I've drawn from Virginia Woolf's work at other times in the past as well. And I forget the next part of the question.
Well, is there a particular book that you know has a message for you rather
Oh,
than
yeah,
to this work?
I think in general, a book that I've just carried with me all my life. In addition, so I love the writers, the Southern writers, Southern Gothic, and the modernists, and those inspired by the modernists. So I love William Faulkner, I love Virginia Woolf. I love Toni Morrison, who was greatly inspired by Faulkner, and but I also love Stanley Elkin, who's a writer that I don't know if people read anymore, but he was a huge star, a huge literary star in the 70s. And one of his books was called The Magic Kingdom, which has this this premise, which seems remarkable. I mean, that it's about, the book is a comedy, basically, about a guy who takes a group of terminally ill children to Disneyland. And so the ironies and I mean, just the potential for failure with such a concept is Stanley Elkin is the type of writer who would take that on, and he does, and it's a brilliant and beautiful and powerful and moving book, and I feel like I've drawn from that. And in the book I'm writing now, certainly, I'm trying. There's a particular thing that happens in the book that I am trying to steal and make it my own, which is the character that the children, the terminally ill children, all have a shared dream at one point, which is I think it's just some of my favorite passages in all of literature, and so I want my characters to try to have that shared dream themselves.
It was a great answer, and actually it was a great question. So what is coming next? Can you talk about what you're working on, or should we just wait and see?
Oh, I guess I can tell you. I mean, I'm not superstitious in that regard, but and plus I have the book contract already, so there's but it starts with the Titanic. I mean, I guess I could tell you, and involves a few Titanic survivors, and it involves World War I. It involves a candy heiress, and we're back in Paris. There's a bookseller that plays a part. So hopefully when I'm done with it, the description that I just gave you is the same description as the book that I write.
Well, we'll look forward to that, and hopefully when it's published, maybe you'll come back and tell us all about it. Thank you so much for being our guest today. The Perfume Thief evokes times in the past, and it builds really convincing characters, complex characters. If you want to buy a copy, there is a link on the Millim website that will earn a few pennies per copy for Millim, but the book won't cost you any more. And to say thank you to you, Timothy, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. So hopefully you like that. We'll get your address.
Thank you so much.
We'll get your address by email when we've finished. Now, just a few words for our audience about our future program. As I say, this is our last event of the year, but we return on the 10th of January, jointly with the Jewish Historical Society of England, and welcome Lola Fraser, who will be speaking about Jewish members of Parliament who served Britain during the First World War. Then on the 17th of January, Helen Fry is back to discuss her latest book, Spy Master: The Secret Life of Kendrick. And finally, for now, on the 24th of January, we welcome Ingrid Alpern to speak about her memoir, My Separate Worlds, Daughter of the Holocaust and Evangelical Christianity. please do visit our website at milim.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter to make sure you don't miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you want. There's a link in the chat, and that will help with the costs of putting on these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Timothy Sharfut, once again. Thank you so much, Timothy.
Oh, thank you. This is a delight.
And have a great break, everyone. Have a great festive season. Looking forward to seeing you all next year. And until then,